India's President Pranab Mukherjee arrives in China for high-level talks on the agenda terror, trade and strategic ties. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu and this is The Heat. Their common history goes back thousands of years, but the modern relationship between India and China can be traced to 1950, when India was among the first countries to end formal ties with the Taiwan region and recognize the People's Republic as China's sole legitimate government. Fast forward to today, when China and India have the highest GDP growth among major nations and a burgeoning trade partnership. Still, the relationship is not without its challenges, a nagging boundary dispute, Pakistan, and concerns over the South China Sea among them. Later, we'll talk with China's former Consul General to India and the head of the China-India Institute. But we begin with India's former Foreign Secretary and first female ambassador to China, Nirupama Rao. I spoke with her earlier and began by asking about what she has called unresolved problems between the two countries.
Well, first of all, let me say that this is a hugely important relationship for us in India, as I would assume it is for our friends in China. It's often referred to as a 1,000-year relationship, perhaps even more than 1,000-year relationship. And if you look at the history of the relations, we've had a pretty intense period of interaction through ancient history. Which was in a sense fractured in the colonial period of our past, in India particularly, and revived then in the 1950s. And we had, good relations for a brief period in the 1950s, followed by the border conflict in 1962. And when I refer to unresolved problems between the two countries, I essentially refer to the fact that we do have an unresolved boundary question, as it's often referred to, between our two countries. But despite that, I believe what is remarkable about this relationship is that we have been able to put in place what I refer to as a management regime in the relationship. To illustrate that, I would just like to refer to the fact that we have had no conflict on the border that we share between our two countries for over 40 years now. And not a single shot has been fired, as they say, along that boundary. And we have in place confidence-building measures. Our trade has grown phenomenally. The Chinese have invested in India, in project exports, in many of our new schemes to grow our economy, to promote manufacturing. So all in all, I would say it's a multifaceted relationship today.
Right. So you say the issues right now are being managed, but are you confident that they can be resolved ultimately to the satisfaction of both sides?
It is a complex problem, and both sides have invested a lot of I would say, their best talent in terms of negotiating, in terms of political will to let's say, reduce the differences between us. But it's still, in my view, some time away from resolution. And given the complexity of the problem, I don't think we should rush into solutions either. We should prepare the people of both countries as to what an eventual solution can be. I think the management, the education of public opinion is also very necessary as we move towards a boundary settlement. And there has to be, of course, political will at the highest level. And I believe in the leadership today in both countries, there is that political will, there is that resolve and that desire to move towards a settlement.
As you say, confidence building measures have put in place, certainly, and trade is expanding between the two countries. But if we look recently at one of the actions on the part of the Indians, on May 18th to be exact, 4 Indian Navy ships were deployed. They were armed with missiles. They're set out for the South China Sea and the Northwestern Pacific. And an Indian spokesman described this action, this deployment, as a, quote, demonstration of its operational reach and commitment to India's Act East policy. Is there something of a message here for China with this kind of deployment?
Well, I wouldn't say this is a message for China. The spokesman referred to the Act East policy.
Right.
and the fact that we are engaging much more closely with this area of Southeast Asia, which essentially we were connected with throughout history. And when I think of the South China Sea connecting with our part of the world, it connects with the Bay of Bengal. And the Bay of Bengal is the sea which Indians always saw as the connecting link to Southeast Asia. That's where our ships and people roamed through the centuries. And today, if our Navy is moving into these waters and, the fact that we're able to demonstrate that we have a state-of-the-art blue water Navy today is basically to illustrate the closeness that India has always felt towards this region of Asia, towards this our near neighborhood, as it were.
Right.
I believe with China, with the disputes that China has in the South China Sea, India has always advocated that there is need for a peaceful resolution of these disputes. There is need for a code of conduct that all nations in the region could follow when it comes to dealing with situations of this nature and managing the tensions. I think that's very important because nobody wants to see conflict. $5.3 trillion worth of world trade passes through the South China Sea and by the Bay of Bengal and then to West Asia. So it's very vital that we keep the sea lines of communication open, that there is no conflict, there is confidence and reassurance that the sea will remain peaceful.
But I'm just wondering whether one does run the risk of an action of this kind being seen as a provocation.
Not at all. I don't think India has ever sought to provoke in any context. And I believe that India is an ocean-going power. Look at the natural endowment of India. Look at its long coastline. Peninsular India, if you look at the map of India, it really abuts the Indian Ocean. We have the Arabian Sea to the west of India, the Bay of Bengal to the east, and the Indian Ocean lapping the shores of Cape Kanyakumari in the south. So we are a natural ocean-going nation, and I think we are essentially, we believe that we must fulfill that destiny of ours.
We have now India working very closely with the United States in areas of defense. How does that kind of collaboration impact India's relationship with China?
We've said time and time again that this is not directed against China. As I said at the outset, what we have with China is a hugely important relationship. We are neighbors, and there is so much invested in the need to build this relationship that we have with China and to maintain peace on our borders, to build confidence and to resolve our problems. And that's really the orientation of the government and policymakers, and indeed all people who focus on this relationship. So I don't believe the fact that we are cementing our defense relationship with the United States as part of the partnership, the strategic partnership that India and the United States are building, as you've seen over the last decade. It's not, I believe, and I believe this at the core of what I think on the issue, it's not meant to provoke China. It's certainly not intended to do that. I think we need to work together, all of us, and that includes China, the United States, India, the other countries in the region. I refer to Japan and Australia, Singapore, for instance, which is a very, very important partner of India in Southeast Asia. I think we must demonstrate that we can come together in concert, as it were, and work out an architecture, a security architecture for the region, which is open, which is well structured, which is inclusive, and which essentially at its heart focuses on the maintenance of peace and confidence building.
So ultimately, do you see some kind of trilateral relationship evolving here between these three countries?
I don't see why not.
Yeah.
The United States and China share a very, very vital and well-developed relationship, may I say. We are developing that kind of relationship with the United States today, and we have a relationship with China, as I said, which is very vital to peace and security in our region. There's no reason why these three big countries, two from Asia, one from the Pacific in many ways, should be working together to see how we can build a truly, what shall I say, a 21st century big power relationship.
Right. Let's look at the economic relationship between India and China. Here you have two countries with huge economies, yet if we look at the volume of trade between these two countries, they don't really reflect the size of those economies, do they?
I agree that the potential has not been tapped in these economic relations between India and China. But if you look at the way trade has grown between our two countries over the last decade and a half, I think the rate of growth has been certainly very impressive. The fact is that India has a huge imbalance of trade with China, and China exports much more to India than we do to China. So we really need to open the universe a little more for India in China when it comes to trade. But our Prime Minister, Mr. Modi, has said this time and time again during his visit to China last year, and when your president was in India, and on numerous occasions when our leaders have interacted, that India and China can learn a great deal from each other as far as their development stories are concerned.
Right.
And the fact that China has progressed so phenomenally over the last 3 decades incorporates many lessons for India. And I think we look at that with an open mind.
Right. India is also, of course, a member of the Chinese-led Asia Infrastructure and Investment Bank, the AIIB, which is a big development,
That's right.
not just in that part of the world, but throughout the world. But India is not that involved in China's regional economic initiative, the One Belt, One Road initiative. Does India have economic expansion or outreach aspirations of its own?
Well, it's connectivity. I think that's really at the heart of all this. That's what China is seeking through OBOR and is implementing as we speak. And that's what India looks to see put in place when it comes to our own dealings and our interaction in the region. India is a part of South Asia, as you know. It is the largest economy in South Asia, and we have neighboring countries with which we are tied through culture, history, ethnicity, and also economic compulsion. And our focus today in our region is to build that connectivity. And for India, I think one matter of concern, and I'd like to be frank about it, is the fact that China and Pakistan have a very close relationship. It's a strategic relationship and built over, the 4 to 5 decades that we've seen recently. You have a China-Pakistan economic corridor that is being conceived of as part of OBOR, and that passes through territory in Kashmir, which is claimed by India and which is currently under Pakistani occupation. And that corridor, that artery that you're building to Gwadar in Baluchistan will pass through that territory, and that certainly raises questions in India and is a subject of considerable debate and discussion. So that is something that we need to perhaps discuss a little more. And I would say that where China is concerned, China is a large country and it's progressed so phenomenally. China should be looking at how it can engage more closely with India on issues that concern our future, that concern our common destiny. And I think on issues like counterterrorism, for instance, India and China should be doing much more because our futures are affected. We are in the same boat, as it were, when it comes to that particular issue. And there's no reason why China should not explore with India how it can expand connectivity with our country, with India, across our northern frontiers. Even though we don't have a settled border, it's true that there are disputes between our two countries. Why can't we build a consensus? I call it a Himalayan consensus. Why can't we build a Himalayan consensus where we're able to look at the people who are involved and look at issues like climate change, the melting of our glaciers, the sharing of waters, for instance, river waters, and just promoting the well-being and the development and livelihoods of the people, as I say, the people in between who exist from the Hindu Kush Himalaya to the Arakans in Myanmar, Burma.
Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Pleasure to be here.
When we come back, the view from Beijing. Plus, we'll talk with the head of the China-India Institute. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat. Welcome back. We're talking about China and India relations. Joining us here in Washington is the co-founder and managing partner of the China-India Institute, Heian Wang. And with us from Beijing is Liu Youfa. Among his postings as a member of China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, he served as Consul General to India and is currently Vice President of the China Institute of International Studies. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Liu Youfa, let me start with you. As we just heard in that interview from Ambassador Rao, one of the unresolved problems, as she puts it, are border issues between China and India. China, for its part, says that it's willing to speed up negotiations towards a solution. What is the issue here and what are the possible solutions?
We all understand it's the legacy left over by the British colonial rule. And as a result, the Indian government and the Chinese government have been working on this issue very seriously. Lately, especially with the visit by Chinese President Xi Jinping to India and the reciprocal visit by Prime Minister Modi to China, both governments have agreed to expedite the diplomatic negotiations in this regard. The two governments have so far agreed to compartmentalize the issue while concentrating efforts on the bilateral cooperations in many other areas so that they would in turn facilitate conditions for the successful resolvement of the border issue.
And Liu Youfa, what are the other major issues that are preoccupying these two countries?
Well, this is the border issue is one. And the second is the trade deficit. Last year, the bilateral trade stood at about 60-some billion US dollars, was the trade deficit totaling at about 44-some billion US dollars. This is an issue which will take the political determination of both sides to try to resolve them peacefully or amicably to both sides. I think this is the very personal touch to many Indian friends. But I can see it. The possible way to resolve this issue is very simple. For India and China to push forward the bilateral investment so that the production links would be shifted to Indian side. This immediately would help to reduce the trade deficit. And secondly, it would be better for India to produce the quality goods which would be acceptable at the Chinese market. And thirdly, both countries can have the joint venture productions so that they could be exported to the third markets. It would help in turn reduce the overall trade deficit from Indian side.
Heian Wang, let's talk about defense issues for a moment. India and the United States are working closely in the area of defense. Does that collaboration impact China's relations with India?
Should not and will not. I think that India is very free in terms of pursuing its own foreign policy. I also see that major powers relationships is always multidimensional. They could be run independently on different tracks. You have the economic cooperation track, the defense and security track, geopolitical track, multilateral institutions track. So one doesn't have to impede the development of another track. For example, on global issues, China and India see eye to eye, whether it's reforming international systems, addressing climate change, overall maintaining regional peace, see very much on eye to eye on South and South, cooperation, AIB Bank, etc. Economically, and there's a lot of need for deepen the relationships. And geopolitically, yes, they do have some tensions. Earlier you mentioned the border issue, but there is also the Pakistan issue, which is also very thorny for India in particular. But none of those should make a material difference in terms of each country's pursuit of its own independent relationship with another country. It should not. But I want to also comment earlier about another issue regarding trade deficit. Trade deficit was more of a big issue when the last 2-3 years when India was running a big trade deficit. And most of that trade deficit was coming from India's reliance on importing oil. As oil prices go down, India's overall trade deficits go down. So that political urgency to address trade deficit, I think, is less right now. That's one. Two, even though India runs a trade deficit with China, but overall it's good for India because India does need the machinery, does need to build its manufacturing sector. So for India, addressing the manufacturing deficit is far more important than addressing the bilateral trade deficit with China, because if it enhances India's overall manufacturing competitiveness, and if the machinery coming from China is much cheaper than coming from another country, it's good for India.
Okay, Li Yofei, I want to stay with defense issues for a moment. About a week ago, 4 Indian Navy ships, they were armed with missiles, set out for the South China Sea and the North Pacific. An Indian spokesman said it was part of India's Act East policy. But does China see this kind of deployment as a bit of a provocation?
No, definitely no. Let me tell you why. Both India and China are the global powers now. So as global powers, their naval presence will be anywhere they like. But the precondition in vis-a-vis Asian Pacific is that any country is supposed to coming in and bringing the constructive roles to the peace and regional peace and security. So long the India is abiding by this principle, China welcomes the constructive presence here in the Asian Pacific area. And at the same time, Chinese Navy is also presence in Indian Ocean. It will abide by the same principle, I suppose. Back to you.
Yeah, Wang, you mentioned a moment ago the deficit between India and China and the efforts to close that gap. There's something else. I mean, these are two countries with very high GDP economies. Yet the volume of trade between the two countries doesn't seem to reflect that.
Yes, and that is for several reasons. One is that it just started from a very low base. Even in 2000, the bilateral trade was only at $3 billion. So from $3 billion between 2000 to 2012, the bilateral trade actually has gone through a tremendous period of growth, growing at 30% annual rate. That is twice the pace of the world trade and much higher, 10% higher than each country's trade with the rest of the world. 2012 to now, it has slowed down somewhat because both economies have slowed down, and also at one point India had some hesitation in exporting iron ore to China. So that was coming from a very low base as one. Two, I really think that it is because of the weakness in India's manufacturing. As India launches its Make in India campaign and it becomes successful in building more high quality products and manufacturing more products to export to China, I think that deficit will close, the gap will reduce somewhat. And I also think that there are certain products that India can export more to China, and China should welcome that. That is, for example, drugs and pharmaceuticals, or agricultural products. Another area for reducing that gap is for exporting the Indian services to China. Right. That is a big part of India's trade, even though China is India's biggest merchandise trade partner, but services trade is barely existing. So, and India is a big power in exporting services, and those services could be IT services, but tourism is a big part. Education, tourism, for example, visiting the traditional historical sites in India. There's a lot of growth there.
Okay, you mentioned Pakistan a moment ago. I want to go to Li Yofei and ask him about that relationship and his perspective on it. Ambassador Rao, in that interview that we did, raised her concern concerning China and Pakistan's close strategic relationship, and she also said that there was concern over the economic corridor that's being developed in China as part of China's One Belt, One Road initiative. Is that in some way an obstacle to better relations between India and China, and perhaps a bigger role for India in China's One Belt, One Road policy?
First, China is opening its arm to all the countries around China vis-a-vis the construction of the One Belt, One Road. And when you talked about the economic corridor between China and Pakistan, it's not a tool which is meant to set against India at all. It's meant to promote the cooperation among countries in the region, which includes India. So, to my understanding, that both Pakistan and India are China's very close friends. China has been implementing a dual friendship policy vis-a-vis the bilateral relations with Pakistan and India. China refuses to take sides on the major issues relating to the disputes between Pakistan and India. Likewise, with the construction of the proposed economic corridor, this is something which is subject to the friendly discussions between India and Pakistan. And when India becomes more involved with the construction along that, economic corridor, then we can sit down and talk about it. So this is not really an impediment or the preconditions for India to be more involved in the construction of the One Belt, One Road.
Right. Hey, Yan Wang, one question on the Indian president's visit to China. The Indian president's role is largely ceremonial. Would not relations have been better served if the Prime Minister had gone? I mean, the Prime Minister has more political clout.
The Prime Minister went there last year following President Xi's visit to India. And even though it's ceremonial role and not in the government branch, but it does send messages. And I think that President Xi and in his president meeting and they do send messages. One message is that we want to accelerate resolution of the border issues, and I think that it is not just symbolic. And I think that it moves this high level meetings does move the relationship into a positive directory. I also want to comment on the earlier kind of Pakistan issue. Yes, it is very sensitive running through the Kashmir in terms of the China-Pakistan corridor. But looking at it another way, most of that $46 billion commitment to building a corridor is towards building power in Pakistan. And if that contributes to a better power infrastructure, and better power infrastructure leads to better economic development, and better economic development leads to a richer, more stable Pakistan, reducing poverty, which is, I think, a more prosperous Pakistan is good for India and good for China as well.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to both of you for joining us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Arnold Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.